Okay, today we are going to go over a set of carburetors that needs cleaning, just kind of a basics, beginning steps for how to clean carburetors. This isn't rejetting carbs for any modifications on a bike, and it's certainly not a full rebuild in that sense, mostly just a general cleaning for what you would expect to do on a bike that's been sitting for a little while and maybe doesn't run quite right currently. So we have a set of carburetors from a CB360. These are a CV style carburetor versus a slide style carb. A couple of different variations on bikes over the years, but essentially the same of what you'd experience on most any Japanese cycle from about this era, perhaps 1970 through, let's say, 2005, 2010, somewhere in there. Carburetors are pretty much the same on all applications like this, so we're going to go ahead and get started with what we have for tools. Okay, so we have just a regular number 2 Phillips screwdriver, a small flathead screwdriver here, a pick tool just kind of for scraping stuff out, and once we have the carbs cleaned, we can set the floats with a float gauge here. You can also make one yourself. I can show you that later. And this is actually just a set of pokey tools used to clean out and remount the jets. Some people don't prefer them. It depends on the jet for what you're going to use though. And then we have some carburetor cleaner spray, and at the end we'll use some Seal All to stick everything back together. We'll go ahead and get started by removing the float bowls on the carbs here, but a lot of times people are confused about what components are called in a carburetor. It's not strictly speaking necessary to understand how all the components work in relation to one another or what they're even called in order for you to just remove the float bowls, spray everything out, put it all back together, and try it from there. But if you can pick up on some of the vocabulary terms, that would definitely be to your benefit. Alright, let's pull these screws on the float bowls here. Some people are pedantic about screws. We'll go ahead and use a bowl. Okay, so we have the float bowls removed there. A little bit of dried fuel debris in there, not too bad. Pretty easy to spray that out and scrape it and get them all cleaned up. That's not a big deal there. We also want to check a couple of things while you have the float bowls off. You want to check this gasket here. These are a little bit flat, which happens over time, but they aren't cracked or brittle or damaged in any way, so we can actually seal this up with Seal All when we reassemble. We have yet to find a really excellent replacement for these seals. Most of them come in a round configuration, and that makes it difficult to reinstall. So if your gaskets are in decent shape like this, you can just seal them up when you're done and move on from there. You also want to check this brass overflow tube. Sometimes they get a crack or a split. Sometimes that's right at the bottom there where it meets the aluminum. If that gets damaged in any way, you'll leak fuel out of that tube despite your float settings and everything being correct. So that's something else you want to double check, as well as the drain screw right here. Typically there's an O-ring behind that. If you don't have to, you don't need to remove this. Sometimes removing it will disturb that O-ring, and if you don't have to, you just leave it alone. Alright, so we'll remove this float pin here. This is just a brass hinge pin that the float rests on. Sometimes they get chowdered or a little bit of debris on there. It'll prevent the float from hinging smoothly. See here, this one's nice and springy. Alright, once the float is off, you want to check it over. Make sure there's no damage to the float itself. Sometimes these floats are made out of a brass canister. Okay, here's an older style float, which is a hollow metal canister. And you see this one has a puncture in it, so you want to check that out, make sure you don't have any damage to your float. And this is a newer style, which is not hollow. It's a full piece there. Here's a damaged float that I've saved. It has a chunk missing out of it there, so you just want to look for any kind of damage like that to your float. And if you don't see anything like that, you can proceed. Next we have our float needle. The float needle itself here has a little retaining tang at the top, which keeps it attached to the float. You want to make sure that that's present. Some bikes don't have them. It's okay if you don't see one typically. But here's a rubber tip on there that you want to make sure is in good condition. Sometimes they are metal. You want to make sure it does not have any damage to that tip or any uneven surfaces there. You also want to check the tip of it here to make sure that this is springy. If it is frozen in place, you can try soaking it or wiggling it in circles, something like that, trying to free it up, but this needs to have that springy tip on it, on your float needle there. This float needle looks to be in good order, so we can proceed with using this part. Okay, here, underneath where the float needle sits is the float needle seat. This little brass piece there underneath this screw plate is the receptacle that the float needle indexes into. And together, this needle and seat combination, as dictated by the float, will shut off or allow fuel flow. You want to check this seat out to see if it wiggles or moves around anyway. If your float needle seat moves at all, as this one does, it's probably going to leak if you put the carburetors back together, so we're going to try and remove this one here. A little bit of spinning motion there. And it pops right out, so that leads me to believe that this O-ring is worn out. We'll go ahead and replace that one. If yours does not remove easily, or it doesn't spin or anything like that, you can probably get away without replacing the O-ring. It may be a source of a leak, so you want to be aware of that, but check it out, see what you have. The needle seat here itself appears to be in good order. We just need to replace that rubber part. Alright, we will remove the main jet here. And the main jet emulsion tube came with it there. These are two pieces here. They don't need to be removed in order to be cleaned, but it's good to know that they have two separate functions and separate names. Just looking this over here, it appears to be in good order. We can just soak this along with the rest of the jets, but it looks like everything's in order there. And you want to double check that the number on your jet corresponds with the factory size or the expected size if your bike has been modified. And here we have the main nozzle, which is just another jet there, and looks pretty good there. And underneath this we have our slow jet or pilot jet. That, I would say, the pilot jet is typically the most important part of a carburetor cleaning, simply because the pilot jets have the smallest diameter orifices in them, which are the most prone to build up on a bike that's been neglected for any amount of time. Certainly the rest of a carb clean is also important, but this is usually the most overlooked thing when someone is doing a carb clean for the first time, kind of unfamiliar, something like that. So the most important thing is to look through it and make sure that you can see daylight through there. And I do have a little bit of a tiny pinhole there. It's definitely not the full diameter that I'm expecting. So we'll need to clean that out either with some spray, compressed air, something like that. And on the side here we have our final guy, which is the idle mixture screw. It's very important to remove those and clean that passage as well. Okay, on the idle mixture screw there we have an O-ring to check, as well as a spring that kind of keeps everything seated. Sometimes there is a small metal washer on there as well. It kind of depends. Make sure to look at a parts diagram to be sure you know what you're expecting. But these components just need to be looked over and checked. Typically this O-ring is usually fine. Sometimes they get cracked and brittle, but usually this one's okay. Okay, so we have all of the jets removed there. We can go through the emulsion tube, the main jet, the nozzle, and the slow jet, clean everything there, as well as spray down the carburetor bodies and the float bowls themselves. Okay, so I'm just going to fill a bowl with a little bit of spray here and put the pilot jet in. If you can see it's submerged. It would typically be a good idea to soak this until the fluid evaporates there, or maybe an hour or something like that, just to kind of get everything soaked through. This jet looked like it would be pretty good, but this is just the procedure you would go to for a very difficult jet situation. Alright, we'll spray that out with a little bit of compressed air. And have another look there, and it looks really nice and clear. I have a small, completely round hole all the way through the jet, which is what you're looking for. Okay, just looking at the tops of the carburetors here, we can compare. These are some parts carbs from a CB350. This is a slide style carb, and this is a CV or constant velocity style carb. The top of the carburetors are different. The bottoms are essentially the same. So if yours look like this, inside they have these slides, which are operated directly by the throttle. And that's how those function. Typically, you don't need to remove the tops of these style carbs. Alright, we can remove our slide diaphragm there. I just want to check over the needle itself, make sure that there's no pitting or debris stuck on there. If so, you can use a little bit of wet paper towel to remove that. Check over the barrel of the diaphragm as well, make sure that's all good. And then, most importantly, the rubber diaphragm itself. You want to make sure there are no tiny pinholes. Even the smallest hole in this can have issues with your throttle response. This one looks to be in good order. And make sure to set these aside so that they don't get damaged by getting any spray or debris, anything on them. Alright, we will spray these out with a little bit of carb cleaner. And these look quite clean, so I don't have to go too aggressively, but if yours look grungy, you want to make sure to really clean that out. Maybe let it soak. Do it a couple of times. You can even use a pick tool, something like this, to just scrape away at it. And also make sure to get that idle mixture screw passageway. And just kind of rotate the carbs around, spraying out everything as you go. Alright, we'll carefully spray out the bowl without trying to get the cleaner on the O-ring there. And then I'll use a pick tool here just to kind of scrape away at that. Okay, nice and clean there. The idle mixture screw here, we just want to make sure that the tip is nice and clean and straight. It's not a hollow jet in any way, it's just an end screw. So just want to make sure that everything looks good there. And we'll spray through the main jet there. Looks good. You just want to be careful not to spray it in your eyes there. Make sure you have some safety glasses. The float needle seats are typically always fine unless somebody has tried to remove them unsuccessfully and damaged them. Typically they are just fine. Again, we'll be replacing those O-rings on both of these just because they were a little bit loose. Next we need to set the float heights on the carbs before putting the float bowls back together. Essentially you just need to confirm that they are at the factory setting. The float height controls the amount of fuel in the float bowl chamber, and that in turn affects mixture. So we need to just double check that here. These CB360 carbs need to be 18.5 millimeters. In order to do that, you can use a float gauge here. So you can use a float gauge like this, which is essentially measuring from this surface here to this surface here. You can also make something like this out of cardboard, cardstock, piece of paper, whatever you want to do. If you're just doing this one time, you don't have to invest in this tool if you don't want to. Okay, so you're just checking the measurement between this gap here and the end of the float itself right there with this gauge. You essentially start above it there and slide beyond. Just like this. And you're measuring to see if the float itself, the tang on the float, if it touches the tip of the float needle. And this one looks to be just about perfect. It's touching but not compressing that little float needle that we were looking at before. Now that we know both of the float heights are correct there, we can proceed with putting the carbs back together. That's essentially it for our carb cleaning. This isn't a full rebuild. Obviously, if there are more problems with your carbs after doing this, you can proceed to diagnose them from there, but typically this is what you need to do for a bike that's been sitting for a little while, maybe has some stale gas in the carbs and jets. Typically you can use the original jets. In fact, original used jets are what you want to use. If there is damage to a jet in some way, you can look to replace it. Otherwise, aftermarket jets tend to be slightly different diameter hole, things like that, where you get some fitment issues in things, where I recommend using the original jets if they are savable and cleanable, and just replace the rubber parts as needed throughout the process. But essentially that's what you need to do in order to get your carbs clean. Certain bikes are a little bit different shapes to the jets, different location, things like that. You just want to double check your service manual for settings that you need to go with there. This video was requested from someone on Reddit. If you're looking for help on fixing your motorcycle, you can visit reddit.com/fixit. That's FIXXIT. 2 X's for two-wheeled vehicles. That's how that works. Essentially, it's a forum where people go to submit questions and answer others on how to fix their motorcycle. In any case, I'm Miles. You're extraordinary. We'll see you next time.
This video is sponsored by the Ford Escape.